to the point that we could do what we've done?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of special courage in the first place. Women I was in jail with, I thought, were tremendously courageous, faced, far more difficult situations than I did. So, and I see people in ordinary life. A friend of mine called me last night who has a child with Down syndrome, and I think that takes a certain kind of courage. She said, you make the decision, how you accept that kind of thing. You can either make a positive experience of that, or you can not. And I think that's the point, is making a decision. And in my case, I don't think it was particularly courageous. It was just more a case of looking at the realities. And, I'm very scared of nuclear war. I'm very scared of what it'll do to my kids. I'm very scared of what it'll do to me and the rest of the world. I really like this planet. And I think what most people do is kind of a psychic numbing kind of process. And whether looking at this takes a certain courage, I don't know. I don't think it is even that. I think it's just much more freeing and much more livable to look at this thing and than to hide it under layers of consciousness. And I think I'm just grateful that I've been given the opportunity to both get that kind of information and then meet the kind of people like Phil who showed me what it meant to deal with it in a positive, creative way, and not simply, walk around in some kind of fog of despair.
Mom, I read last night a piece that you had written shortly after goodness of the time the preliminary hearing, shortly after the arrest. At any rate, you're drawing an analogy between your feelings about the death of your mother and how your own family, might view you if you went to prison. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yeah, that was a couple weeks after I was in jail, I think. Probably when I hit the low point, I began to see myself as having made a choice, which in one sense might be looked upon as an equivalent choice of suicide. I was walling myself off in a jail cell, away from my children where I really wanted to be, with them, and wondering, what that would mean to them, and imagining them growing up and starting to shave and, going through a whole period of years without me, and concerned about their knowledge that it had been a choice I had made, rather than, if I had gotten cancer and knew I had to die, or was, contemplating suicide or something that could be looked at as death dealing. And although I saw my choice, I never have not seen my choice as a choice for life. I knew that what it meant was a kind of situation where I would be walled off, sort of sealed off in a way from my kids that would separate me from their growing up experience. And I knew I had to take that feeling that I had and find a way to deal with that, because that was very real. And deal with that in the context of what I had done and why I had done it. And it took some time, a period of probably a month after that in jail, before I could take what I'd written in that day, 2 weeks after arrest, and put it into an article that explained why I would put myself into such a situation. And I think what it came down to was a pair of hard choices. And the hardest choice being to go home, look at my kids, and say, hey, I know nuclear war is coming, and not do what I could do to stop it. And I just decided that was the hardest choice to make. And that separation, as scary as that was to me, and as bad as it may be on my kids, was not as bad a choice as seeing them die of nuclear war, or seeing them get to a situation where, they would look at me and say, "What did you do? Why didn't you try to stop this?"
Did you discuss your feelings with them?
Sure. Over and over again. I talked for months with my kids, well, for really the last couple of years, about the possibility of my doing something that might put me in jail and what that might mean. I think it was sort of a certain unreality to that, because it was at that point kind of speculative, and neither I nor they knew what that would entail or what it would be like. But I did what I could to prepare them and to make them understand.
Do you think they do?
Boy, that's hard to say. I hope they have some sense of it. I'm very, very happy the two boys are here and got inside the courtroom. Got to hear Dan's fine, marvelous statement in the courtroom. I feel really that, if anything, what I want to teach them, and it's sort of aside from going to jail and not going to jail, is to live fully and live out conscientiously what you believe. And that's a very freeing experience and a very good experience. And if they can catch a little bit of that from me and understand that a little bit, understand the nuclear war questions or the political issues, that's the bottom line for me.
Molly, you said that you felt obligated to do what you could to stop nuclear war. And I know that one of the things that's been said often by your supporters as well as your critics is, why did you think that an action like this would stop nuclear war?
I didn't know if it would.
Can you explain that? I think it's interesting.
Well, I think what it came down to finally was stopping the calculation and the pragmatism and the practicality questions that everybody sort of goes through. Well, if I knew that this would stop war, sure, I'd go to jail too, that kind of thing. If I knew this was going to be an effective action, well, sure, but what you're doing may be just blowing in the wind and wasting everybody's time, and it may be useless and we'll all die anyhow. And I had to get beyond that question and come to just deciding what was the truthful choice for me, what was the real way to live out the faith that I have, that there is a God, and he's a more powerful, she, I think I would say she, is a more powerful God than the power of these weapons in which so many people place their trust. And that further, I think despair is the disease of the age, and that many, many people experience that. And I wanted to get beyond the despair and come up with a basis for hope. And hope isn't, looking at things and seeing things optimistically. Isn't that? That's being optimistic. Hope is looking at an abyss and, just refusing to step into it.
Well, do you have a kind of apocalyptic vision of things that we've seen in terms of the dynamics?
Of the arms race? I think it's going to be very, very difficult to turn aside. I think we're at a very, very late period in the process of trying to change it. There may be some hope in that if people do see the absolute seriousness of it, we may be able to make some historical changes, such as was made at the time of abolition with slavery, where finally war begins to be seen as something that's absolutely useless and does not have to be, and is an institution that can be gotten beyond historically. I think there's a possibility of that if people really come to see the absolute uselessness of war. And I think it's possible we could reach that. But I don't have any great optimism about people changing that quickly.
Well, I guess I'm trying to say is that the kind of drift of history, so to speak, or the force, the karmic force of our situation of civilization seems to be pushing us towards some kind of impending massive disaster. And you and the other people involved in this action are few in number. But what I'm trying to say, do you think that that the action that you've taken, symbolic and as real as it is, has any potentiality for waking enough people soon enough to head off what seems to be so impending? And I'm saying that in terms of the kind of apocalyptic vision that's been talked about in the Bible and other sources of prophecy, like the book of the Hopi, who say that we're coming near the end.
Yeah. I think it still comes down to a human choice. I think it was human choice that brought us here. And it's human choice that's going to turn it around if that happens, if it can happen. And I think that's where the question of one's own responsibility comes in, and one's own set of choices. Either you drift along and on the tide of history and let it all happen, or you do what you can to change it. And quite frequently, it's been a few people that have changed history. You can look back and see that is the case. I know Ramsey's referred several times to William Lloyd Garrison and the Grimke sisters in abolition, and how even up to and beyond the time of emancipation, they were still thought of as nuts. And they were still, a tiny minority in many respects. But, we can look back now and say, yeah, a few people did have some impact. I don't know if it's us, but I still see that as a possible process.
Sort of what the prophet Micah said, that in the last days they shall turn their swords into plowshares. I thought that's an interesting qualification.
Yes.
That's not until the last days.
The last days, yeah.
And then the they is an interesting pronoun, too. Who is that?
They is we, I hope. All of us.
We're trying to turn our cameras and plowshares.
Beautiful idea.
Well, some kind of enlightened potentiality in terms of meaning, which is something that, unfortunately, is pretty rare, actually. I mean, it's as rare as your action.
Sure. The media is sucked in,
They're caught within their own media perspective, too.
Maybe you tell us a little bit about your perception of the court and the judge.
Well, I don't like to lay a number on the judge. Probably his ineptitude, it's given us as many opportunities and has made visible, some of the insanities of the courtroom situation. It's widespread, not simply taking place in his courtroom. So I don't want to lay a heavy trip on Samuel Salas. I think he is not all that different, except he's a little more inept than any court in the nation. There just aren't courts that want to listen to these questions, which are very valid questions to be raised legally.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. You had a brief that you presented that was not discussed in open court, citing some laws, some statutes that really provided explicitly for the kind of action that you did. And one of the things I noticed in that brief was the statement that this is not a novel argument. I'm sure you know more about those laws, having spoken with the attorneys at some length about it. You might like to explain what they are.
They're particularly the Pennsylvania statutes on justification, which make clear that one can, and indeed in instances, be obligated. There's another law about failure to prevent a catastrophe, which I think is in that brief, so that it's clear that one may be obligated, or at least one is free from criminal being called a criminal, being treated as a criminal, if you break a law in order to prevent far greater danger. And I think we were making a very good case for justification in terms of the nuclear arms threat, and that was analogous to the example the judge used of the person breaking into a house to save human lives in the case of a fire or a possibly explosive situation. And, we were just saying, open the scale of that to include mass genocide. And then you can get at some point, the sense of what we're talking about. That's what we're all about, trying to prevent. And I don't know what the jurors are doing with that right now. It sounds like they're quibbling over surreptitious and subterfuge, so it doesn't sound like they've gotten the point of that. Unfortunately, because we didn't get to argue the brief and because we didn't get to really put that argument seriously before the court. We suggested it in court, but we didn't get to, put it forward in a very specific fashion that clearly laid out and logically carried the argument through. So I'm sure the jurors hearing that and then hearing the charge of the judge, are feeling at this point, even if they would like to let us go, limited by the law. I think there's another point, too, that jurors are never charged with, and that is the fact that they have consciences, and that no judge can exact a penalty against a jury for finding people not guilty, even if they don't apply the law as he sets it out. That they have a right, as jurors, to follow their consciences. And I think that's a basic precept that, goes back in history as far as John Adams in this country, and William Penn, who, is a very important local figure in the history of William Penn. There was he was put on trial for sedition.
Well, for meeting with co-religionists, which is against the law, and I suppose it was sedition.
Yeah, and the jury found him not guilty, and they were put in jail at that point. At this point,
and they knew they would be put in jail.
They knew they would be put in jail, and they went ahead and found him not guilty. So that's certainly a clear example of the fact that there is a right to do that. And today it's in case law that they wouldn't, the jurors across the street could find us not guilty, and they certainly wouldn't be put in jail. And they certainly could be acting as conscience. And I suggested they needed to be acting not only as community conscience, but conscience of the nation.
I was going to say that it seems to me that the strategies that you undertook somewhat sabotaged your own potentiality as far as being acquitted goes. I'm not saying that it wasn't the right thing to do, but particularly in terms of the 4 defendants who went out to GE, and rather than making statements and testifying and attempting to convince the jury of some kind of justification, although it was going to be difficult.
What happened with Elmer Maas was that he tried to get to the factual basis for a justification argument, and every time he brought it up, he was cut off. I think the turning point and the key decision was the decisions of the judge not to let the expert testimony in, which would give a reasonable basis, by experts for our intent, for our ideas that weren't simply our own kind of ideas that came out of the sky and out of the clouds, but that there were, very strong logical arguments to put us in the frame of mind, to give us the intent that what we were doing was, in fact, justifiable. He just cut the bottom out of that, and then he limited the testimony of Elmer Maas, the second person that was testifying in his own defense, so that all he was going to let in was opinionated things. How did you get to this opinion? And then as soon as you'd say, well, I read this particular thing, he wouldn't allow him to go on and say what it was that he'd read in Dr. Falk and the various experts he cited. So it became farcical at that point. I just particularly felt that I didn't want to go into that courtroom and give credence to that whole scene and say, yes, this is somehow we're going to plod through and convince a jury, maybe a 1 in 1,000 chance that we would convince a jury based on the very little information they'd been given and the fact that we'd been, cut off at every point. To give credence to that as a judicial process that was something that we should go along with, I think at that point, was not to tell the truth.
So the decision, I assume, was a group decision that you wanted to cut through the kind of absurdity of the court itself and to demonstrate by your action and by refusing to participate any further that was a statement, that was your statement of truth at that moment.
I think Phil put it, I don't remember the exact quote, but he stood up and said, well, this court is just, giving a legal basis for the arms race. That's what every court in the country does.
Well, not everyone has, since there have been other instances in which the kind of statutes arguing justification have been invoked. A few only.
There's some legal precedent, but I don't think many courts take the international law and the Nuremberg principles seriously. And,
It really takes some imagination.
It's a very difficult case to argue in these courts, and yet the irony is that it was this country that played the leading role in setting forth those principles for Germans. All we're asking is that the same kind of reasoning that went into the Nuremberg principles be applied in our own case.
Well, so many seem to judge others and judge themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.